Imagine a man who, from the beginning of his journey, was followed by signs and miracles so powerful that the people themselves stopped whatever they were doing to see them. This man was Elisha, the prophet who walked with God in such a special way that, even after his death, the power of God still worked through him. But Elisha was not just anyone. There was a mystery surrounding him, something that caused both respect and fear. His presence was almost a boundary between heaven and earth. The people knew that wherever he went, extraordinary things happened. Bitter water became sweet, a poor widow's oil multiplied, and even an iron axe that had fallen to the bottom of a river floated on the surface as Elisha prayed. And then, when the prophet Elisha finally rested, perhaps some thought that all the signs and wonders were gone with him. But the story tells us something impressive, something that has left many with their hair standing on end. Even after he was dead, Elisha's bones still held the power of the living God. Once, a man was thrown into his pit to be buried in haste, and upon touching the bones of Elisha, he came back to life. Elisha was the prophet who turned fear into hope, but he also showed how deep and serious God's power is. And his story, full of miracles and mysteries, shows us that divine power is something that goes beyond what we can see or understand. Elisha's call for Elijah. Elijah finds Elisha tilling the land and calls him to follow him, throwing his cloak over him as a symbol of the transfer of his ministry. It was an ordinary day in the fields of Abel-Meholah, a small village in the kingdom of Israel. Elisha, a hard-working and dedicated young man, was there, tilling the land with his oxen. He was the kind of man people respected, strong, hard-working, and faithful. Elisha lived with the responsibility of taking care of his family's land, and on that day, he plowed the land using 12 yoke of oxen, a hard job that required great strength and skill. As he concentrated on his task, a figure appeared in the distance that was slowly approaching. This figure was Elijah, the prophet of God, known for his power and closeness to the Lord. Elijah was a man of striking appearance and a presence that emanated authority and spirituality. Many knew the stories of his miracles and his powerful prophecies, for he was God's spokesman at a time when Israel was divided and far from true worship. Elisha noticed Elijah approaching and stopped his work. There was something different about this encounter, something he couldn't understand, but that he felt deep in his heart. Elijah did not say a word as he came near Elisha. He simply approached and, in an unexpected gesture, took off his cloak and threw it over Elisha's shoulders. At that time, a cloak was not just a piece of clothing, it symbolized the authority and mission of those who wore it. Elijah, by throwing his cloak over Elisha, was conveying a calling, the call to serve God as a prophet, to carry the word of the Lord to the people, and to face unimaginable challenges. Elisha understood the meaning of the gesture immediately. He felt the weight of that responsibility on his shoulders, but also the privilege of being chosen for something great. Without hesitation, he left the oxen and the plow and ran after Elijah. "Let me kiss my father and mother, and then I will follow you," said Elisha, showing respect and willingness to say a proper goodbye to his family before embarking on this new journey. Elijah, seeing Elisha's sincerity, allowed him to go and say goodbye. Elisha then returned and accomplished something symbolic. He killed the oxen and used the wood of the plow to prepare a farewell meal for his family and friends. This act was not only a farewell party, but also a decision that he no longer had anything to tie him to his previous life. He was fully committed to God's calling. Thereafter, Elisha joined Elijah, becoming his disciple and assistant, ready to learn and, at the right time, carry on Elijah's ministry. And so, from a simple field worker, Elisha began his journey towards the destination that God had prepared for him, a journey that would bring miracles, challenges and a lifetime dedicated to serving the Lord. This was the first of many steps in Elisha's transformation from an ordinary man to a powerful prophet who would bring hope and the word of God to his people. Elijah's farewell and Elisha's succession. Elisha accompanies Elijah until the moment Elijah is taken to heaven in a whirlwind, and Elisha inherits his master's bent spirit. Elisha had already spent some time with Elijah, learning, observing, and absorbing all he could from the great prophet. Elijah was their teacher, their guide, and above all, a man whose heart burned for God's presence. Elisha knew that one day the role of Elijah would fall upon him, but what he didn't know was when or how it would happen. The day started like any other, but there was something different in the air. Elijah seemed quieter, almost as if he was preparing his heart for a final journey. They traveled from city to city, visiting important places where other prophets of God were. First, Elijah took Elisha to Gilgal, then to Bethel, and then to Jericho. In each place, Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me to another place." But Elisha, determined and loyal, answered firmly, "As the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, I will not leave you." They continued, and at each stop the other prophets approached Elisha and warned him, "Do you know that today the Lord will take your master?" Elisha, already knowing what was coming, only answered, "Yes, I know." "Shut up." He didn't want to talk about it, but in his heart, he was preparing for the moment of farewell. Finally, they reached the banks of the Jordan River. Elijah took off his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the waters. Immediately, the river opened, creating a dry path for them to pass through, just as God had done in the past for the people of Israel. Elijah and Elisha crossed over, walking side by side, with the wind blowing around them, as if even nature were silent, waiting for what would happen next. On the other side of the river, Elijah looked at Elisha with a deep, almost fatherly look and said, "Ask of me what you want me to do for you, before I am taken from you." Elisha, with courage and humility, answered, "Please leave me as an inheritance a double portion of your spirit." Elisha desired not only to follow in the footsteps of Elijah, but to carry the presence of God twice, to be able to serve the people with all the strength and authority that his master demonstrated. Elijah, with a slight smile, replied, "You asked for a hard thing. But if you see me when I am taken from you, so it will be, but if you do not see me, it will not be done." It was as if Elijah was telling Elisha that he would need to keep his eyes steady and his faith strong to receive what he asked for. As they walked and talked, suddenly, something extraordinary happened. A chariot of fire, drawn by flaming horses, descended from the skies. The chariot separated Elijah from Elisha, and in an instant Elijah was taken to heaven in a whirlwind. Elisha stood by in paralysis as his master disappeared into the heavens. Overcome with emotion, he shouted, my father, Israel's chariot and its horsemen." It was an expression of reverence and longing, a farewell charged with respect for his master. Seeing Elijah disappear into the heights, Elisha tore his clothes as a sign of mourning. On the ground beside him was Elijah's robe, left behind as a symbol of all that he had learned and as proof that the ministry now passed into his hands. Elisha took the cloak with trembling but determined hands. He knew that the weight of the calling was now his. With Elijah's cloak in his hands, Elisha returned to the Jordan River, the same one they had crossed together. He rolled up his robe, looked at the waters, and in a firm voice proclaimed, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" As he slammed his cloak on the waters, just as Elijah had done, the river opened once more. It was the confirmation that Elijah's God was now with Elisha. From that time Elisha became the prophet of Israel, with the double portion of his master's spirit. He was no longer alone, he carried the legacy of Elijah and the presence of God with him, ready to face whatever came his way. The purification of the waters of Jericho. Elisha performs his first miracle by purifying the spring of bitter waters of Jericho, making it healthy and capable of sustaining life. Soon after Elisha's return, the people of the city of Jericho came to him with great concern. Jericho was a city with a prime location and beautiful fields all around, but something terrible was happening there. The main source of water was contaminated. The water flowing from this spring was bitter and poisonous, unable to quench thirst without causing trouble. Everything that depended on it was at risk, crops dried up, animals got sick, and even people began to suffer. Life was slipping away from the city. The people of Jericho, knowing that Elisha was God's prophet and trusting in his power, came to him for help. The leaders of the city came up and said, "As you can see, our Lord, this city is well located, but the water is bad and the land unproductive." They had no other source of water. If she was not healed, everything around her would succumb. Elisha listened attentively and then, with authority and trust in God, he did something unusual. He asked for a new dish, a clean container, and told them to bring him salt. That instruction seemed strange, but the people quickly obeyed, bringing the dish and salt to him. Elisha took the dish, salt in hand, and went to the fountain of bitter waters. Everyone watched expectantly, because they knew they were facing a miracle about to happen. Arriving at the well, Elisha threw the salt into the water and, with a firm voice, declared, "Thus says the Lord, I have cleansed these waters, there will be no more death or barrenness in them." He knew that the power was not in the salt itself, but in God's command that the water should be purified. Immediately, the change happened. The water became pure and fresh, and the once contaminated stream was now healthy. The water became crystal clear, shimmering in the sunlight, and those who were nearby were the first to taste the miracle. It was clean water, with no bitter taste or bad effects, a source of life that could now sustain the people, animals, and plants of Jericho. The news spread quickly throughout the city, and everyone was a witness to God's power through the prophet Elisha. They understood that that spring was now blessed, and their land, which had previously been dying, would gain new life. Elisha had demonstrated God's care for the people, and what had once been a symbol of death and barrenness was now a source of life and prosperity. Thus Elisha's first miracle was fulfilled, and the people came to see in Elisha the same authority and presence of God that they had previously seen in Elijah. The Jericho fountain has remained healthy ever since, as a living reminder of the power and goodness of God working through his prophets. The incident with the young mockers. When Elisha is insulted by a group of young men, he invokes a curse, and two shoes come out of the woods, punishing them. After purifying the waters of Jericho, Elisha continued his journey, passing through several cities and taking with him the authority of God. His name was already beginning to be known, and the people had respect for the new prophet of Israel. But there was one incident that would serve to show the power of God and the importance of honoring his servants. At one point, Elisha was on his way to Bethel, a city where idolatry was common, and many turned away from God's teachings. On the way, he was surprised by a group of young people who came out of the vicinity and began to mock him. They were many, and their cries echoed as they surrounded the prophet, showing disrespect and disdain. The young men laughed and shouted, "Come up, bald head! Come up, bald head!" They were ridiculing Elisha, making fun of his appearance, and mocking his role as a prophet. By saying, "Come up," they insinuated that Elisha should disappear from there or even that he should be taken to heaven like Elijah, his predecessor, as if his ministry had no value. Elisha stopped and looked at them with a serious look. He knew that what was happening there went beyond a simple provocation. Those young people represented a profound disrespect for the work of God and his prophets. It was a disdain against divine authority. Elisha then pronounced a curse against them in the name of the Lord, as a way of showing that disrespect for God and his envoys would not go unpunished. Immediately, two bears came out of the nearby woods, advancing against the young. The bears attacked them, causing great fright and injuries. The situation quickly turned into a solemn warning to those who witnessed the incident. God's prophet was not to be treated with disdain, for he carried the message and power of the Lord himself. This event was etched in people's memories as a sign of the respect and reverence that the Lord demands, especially at a time when many were straying from his ways. Elisha continued his journey, and the story of this incident spread, reminding everyone that God was present in Israel, and that respect for the sacred was essential. The multiplication of the widow's oil. Elisha helps a widow fill several vessels of oil, which allows her to pay off her debts and provide for her family. One day, a desperate woman came to Elisha for help. She was the widow of one of Elijah's followers, a God-fearing man who had served faithfully. However, with her death, she and her two children were left in a very difficult situation. Poverty took over his home, and debts began to pile up. Now, the creditor was threatening to take his two sons as slaves, which was allowed at that time to pay off debts. This mother's pain and despair ran deep. She was about to lose everything that was left of her family. When she found Elisha, she threw herself at his feet and told him about her situation, crying out for help. Elisha, with compassion in his eyes, listened attentively and asked a simple question: "What do you have at home?" The woman, distressed, replied that she had nothing of value, just a small bottle of oil. It was little, almost nothing, a minimal amount that was barely fit for his daily use. But Elisha knew that, in God's hands, even the smallest resource could multiply. Then, with authority and trust in God, Elisha gave an instruction that seemed strange but full of faith. He said to the woman, "Go and borrow vessels from all your neighbors, as many as possible. Then, enter your home with your children and close the door. Start filling the containers with the oil from your bottle and separate the full containers." The woman, without hesitation, rushed to do as Elisha had commanded. She and her children went from door to door, asking for vessels of all sizes and types. The neighbors, curious, lent her the canisters without understanding what she planned to do with so many of them. Soon, his house was full of empty containers. With a heart full of faith and hope, the woman entered the house with her children and closed the door, as Elisha had directed. She took her small bottle of oil and, with trembling hands, began to pour the contents into one of the containers. And then, a miracle happened. The oil continued to flow, completely filling the first vessel. The woman and her children looked at each other in amazement. She moved into the second vessel, and the oil continued to gush. One after another, the vessels were filled, and the oil did not stop. It was as if that small bottle was connected to an inexhaustible source. The widow's heart was filled with gratitude and joy with each full vessel, seeing God's care for her family manifest itself so powerfully. She filled one vessel, then another, and another, until all the borrowed vessels were filled with oil. Finally, when she asked for one more bowl, her children said there were none left. And then, the oil stopped flowing. The miracle had been completed with precision. There was no shortage of oil or left, everything had been filled exactly according to the number of vessels they had gathered. With all the vessels full, the woman ran to Elisha to tell him what had happened. With a smile, he directed her, "Go, sell the oil, pay your debts, and with what is left, you and your children will be able to live." That oil, which at one time seemed insignificant, became the means by which God brought provision and relief to that family. The widow sold the oil, paid off her debts, and had enough to support her family, no longer afraid of losing her children to slavery. This miracle became a testimony to the compassion and faithfulness of God, who cares for his own and transforms a little into abundance. The resurrection of the Shunammite son. Elisha performs one of the most impactful miracles when he resurrects the son of the Shunammite woman who had offered him hospitality. In a city called Shunem, there lived a rich and kind woman, known as the Shunammite woman. She and her husband were respected in the city and had a comfortable life, but they did not have children, something she had accepted over the years, despite being a deep sadness. One day, Elisha passed through Shunem on his mission as a prophet, and the Shunammite, observing him, realized that he was a man of God. She then invited him into her home and offered him a meal. Elisha accepted, and it became a routine. Whenever he passed through Shunem, he found hospitality in the home of his wife and her husband. In time, the Shunammite woman had an idea. She spoke to her husband, "We are going to build a little room for the prophet on the roof of our house. We can put a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp there, so that he has a place to rest whenever he comes." The husband agreed, and they did so, providing Elisha with a place where he could rest. One day, Elisha was deeply grateful for all the affection and generosity of the Shunammite woman and her husband. He called his servant Gehazi and said to him, "Ask the woman what we can do for her. She has been so kind to us." Gehazi called the woman, and Elisha asked if she wanted anything, but she humbly replied that she did not need anything, for she already had a good life. But Elisha did not give up. Watching the woman and knowing that she had no children, he realized her hidden desire and announced to her an unexpected promise, "Next year, by this time, you will have a child in your arms." The woman, surprised and moved, could hardly believe it. She said, "Do not lie to your maidservant, O man of God." But Elisha assured him that it was a divine promise. After time, the promise was fulfilled. The Shunammite woman gave birth to a son, and joy filled the home. The boy grew up healthy and strong, bringing joy to his parents' lives. He was the gift she had never dared to ask for, but which God, through Elisha, had granted. However, one day, something terrible happened. The boy was in the field with his father, helping with the harvest, when suddenly he began to cry out in pain, "My head! My head!" The father, worried, asked a servant to take the boy back home to his mother's care. She took him in her arms and held him, but tragically, at noon, the boy died in her arms. Desperate and heartbroken, the Shunammite placed her son's body in the room she had prepared for Elisha, closed the door, and ran to meet the prophet. She knew that Elisha was a man of God and that he was her last hope. Seeing her from afar, Elisha sent Gehazi to find out what had happened, but she insisted on speaking directly to the prophet. When she reached Elisha, she fell at his feet, pouring out her grief. She told what had happened and expressed her anguish. "I didn't ask for a son, my lord. Didn't I tell you not to give me false hope?" Elisha understood the gravity of the situation and immediately left with her for his home. When they arrived, Elisha went up to the room where the boy was lying. He closed the door, being alone with the boy's body, and began to pray intensely to God. Elisha lay down on the boy's body, putting his face on his face, his hands on the boy's hands, and his body on his body. Gradually, the boy's body began to warm up. Elisha got up and walked around the room, praying even more. He lay down again on the boy, and suddenly the boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. Life had returned to his body. Elisha, filled with joy and gratitude, called Gehazi and asked him to bring his mother. When the Shunammite woman came in and saw her son alive, she fell at Elisha's feet in reverence and gratitude. With her eyes full of tears, she took her son in her arms, feeling her heart overflow with joy and relief. God had restored her son to life, and the faith of that mother, along with God's powerful intervention through Elisha, brought victory over death. This miracle was one of the greatest signs of God's power in Elisha's life, confirming him as a true prophet of the Lord and showing that God not only answers prayers but also cares for those who serve him with faith and love. The poisoned herbal puree. Elisha transforms a deadly stew, accidentally poisoned, into safe food for the prophets, demonstrating God's care for his servants. One day, Elisha was meeting with a group of prophets, known as sons of prophets, who were dedicated to learning and teaching the word of God under the guidance of the prophet Elisha. They lived in times of great famine and hardship, where even getting food was a challenge. However, the faith and determination of that group of men held them together, and Elisha, as a leader, did his best to strengthen the faith of each one, even in difficult times. On that occasion, they were all together, and it was time for the meal. Elisha instructed one of his servants to prepare a stew, using any herb or vegetable he could find in the vicinity. The servant, not knowing that among the plants around him were some poisonous ones, gathered a large quantity of herbs and, not realizing the danger, cut them down and put them in the stew, which was boiling in a large pot. When the stew was ready, the smell of hot food spread, bringing hope to those hungry men. One by one, the prophets approached and began to fill their bowls. However, they had hardly taken their first spoonfuls when they began to feel a strange and bitter taste. In a panic, they realized that something was terribly wrong. Some began to feel ill and immediately cried out, "Man of God, there is death in the pot." Hearing the cry of the prophets, Elisha calmly approached. He knew that in situations like this, the Lord could provide a way out. With unwavering faith, Elisha asked for some flour. Although it seemed like an unusual solution, he knew that God could transform any element into an instrument of healing and protection. Elisha took the flour and threw it into the stew pot, without any hesitation. In the eyes of the prophets, that gesture seemed simple, almost ordinary. But for Elisha, it was an act of trust and faith, a way of demonstrating that, with God, even the impossible becomes possible. He then instructed his servants to serve the stew again to the prophets, ensuring that the food was now purified and safe. With faith in the words of the prophet, the men helped themselves once more, and to their relief, the bitter and poisonous taste had completely disappeared. The stew that once brought death was now safe and healthy. They ate and were satisfied, feeling God's presence and care in every spoonful. This miracle was a powerful reminder that God cares for his servants, even in the most difficult and desperate situations. Elisha, with his faith and trust in God's power, demonstrated that he is able to turn danger into protection, scarcity into provision, and despair into hope. The multiplication of the loaves. Elisha multiplies loaves and grain to feed a large crowd of people, foreshadowing the miracle that Jesus would later perform. It was a time of trouble, and many felt the scarcity of food in Israel. Even so, the fame of the prophet Elisha spread, and a group of men dedicated to learning about God, the sons of the prophets, were gathered with him. These men, despite adversity, sought to grow in faith and wisdom under the guidance of the prophet. Each came from different parts of the region, and together they formed a community willing to follow God's ways. One day, while Elisha was teaching and encouraging men on their spiritual journey, a visitor arrived. This man, humble and sincere, approached with a gift. He had brought 20 barley loaves, made simply, and a bag with a few ears of freshly harvested grain. For that man, it was the best he had to offer, a gesture of devotion and respect for God's prophet. Elisha received the gift gratefully, but he knew that the amount was too small to feed all those men. The 20 barley loaves seemed derisory in the face of the hunger and needs of more than 100 people gathered there. Elisha's servant looked at the prophet, questioning, "How can I put this before 100 men?" The doubt was understandable. The servant knew that the amount of food would not be enough. But Elisha, with serenity and confidence, gave a clear and direct command, "Give bread to the people, that they may eat." He added something else, something that left no doubt about what God was about to do. "Thus saith the Lord, they shall eat, and there shall be left." The servant, even without fully understanding, trusted Elisha's word. He began to distribute the loaves and grains among the men, who watched curiously and perhaps a little skeptically, not knowing what to expect. One after another, they stretched out their hands and received their portion of food, and miraculously the amount did not seem to decrease. As the bread passed from hand to hand, everyone began to realize that there was enough for each one, until everyone was full. The food that was supposed to feed only a few had multiplied supernaturally, satisfying the hunger of everyone there. And, just as Elisha had said, there was still more than enough, more than enough. This miracle was not only a sign of divine provision but also a foreshadowing of something greater, something God would do centuries later when Jesus would feed thousands with just a few loaves and fishes. On that day, the faith of the children of the prophets was renewed, and the certainty that God cares for his people grew even stronger. Elisha showed that the God they served was a God of abundance, capable of multiplying the little and turning scarcity into abundance. Every piece of bread that passed through the hands of these men was a living testimony of God's power, a reminder that he sees and knows the needs of his servants and always acts at the right time to supply everything they need. The healing of Naaman, the Syrian general. Naaman, leprous and desperate, is instructed by Elisha to wash 7 times in the Jordan River to be healed, and the leprosy disappears. The story of Naaman, the powerful Syrian general, is one of the most beautiful demonstrations of God's transforming power and how humility and faith can lead to a miracle. Naaman was respected throughout the kingdom of Syria. He was strong, courageous, and had the king's trust. However, despite all his fame and power, he faced a terrible and lonely battle. Naaman suffered from leprosy, a serious and incurable disease that isolated people and left them on the margins of society. This illness not only weakened the body, but also the spirit, as it brought pain, shame and exclusion. In the midst of despair, hope arose from an unexpected place. A young Israelite girl, who had been captured and was serving Naaman's wife, witnessed the general's affliction and, moved by compassion, remembered Elisha, God's prophet in Israel. She told Naaman's wife that Elisha could heal him. This little seed of hope grew, and, anxious for a solution, Naaman went to the king of Syria and obtained permission to travel to Israel in search of his healing. Naaman departed with a large retinue, carrying with him precious gifts, and arrived at the home of the prophet Elisha, believing that he would be received with pomp and reverence. However, Elisha did not come out to receive him personally. Instead, he sent a messenger with simple and surprising instructions. Naaman was to go to the Jordan River and dip 7 times in its waters so that his leprosy would be cured. Upon hearing these instructions, Naaman was indignant. He expected Elisha to come to him, pray with powerful words, and perform a great ritual. Moreover, he did not understand why he should wash in a river in Israel, when there were much more beautiful and respected rivers in Syria, such as the Abana and the Pharpar. Naaman almost gave up and returned home in his anger and wounded pride. However, his servants, recognizing the importance of the moment, asked him to reconsider. They said that if Elisha had asked for something great and difficult, Naaman would have done it. So why not obey a simple act of faith? Naaman pondered these words and, overcoming his pride, went to the Jordan River. He went into the water and dived once, then again, and once more, until he had completed 7 immersions, as the prophet had instructed. And then, as she emerged for the 7th time, something amazing happened. Her skin was clean, like a child's skin. The leprosy had completely disappeared, leaving Naaman healed and transformed, both in body and soul. Gratitude took hold of Naaman's heart. He returned to Elisha's house, full of humility and reverence, wanting to offer gifts to the prophet in thanks. But Elisha, in fidelity to God, refused any reward, making it clear that the miracle was a divine gift, without price. Naaman returned to Syria, not only with a healed body, but with a new heart and a new faith in the God of Israel. He had learned that sometimes God's miracles require humility and obedience. The recovery of the floating axe. Elisha retrieves a borrowed axe that had fallen into the water, causing the metal to float, to everyone's surprise. On one of the many days of work with the sons of the prophets, Elisha was at a site beside the Jordan River. These young men, who had followed Elisha with a desire to learn the Word of God and the spiritual mysteries, were busy building a new place of learning, a prophetic school that would become a center of learning for many. They were cutting down trees, using borrowed axes to get the job done. The day was running smoothly, with the sound of axes beating on the trees, until something unexpected happened. As one of the young prophets cut down a tree by the river, the axe, a heavy iron instrument, slipped out of his hands and fell into the water. The sound of the axe falling into the water was heard by all around, and the young man immediately ran to the shore in despair. He knew that the axe was not his, but borrowed, and he had no way to pay for it. Fear took over her heart. What to do? The axe was expensive, and he had no way to return it. The young man ran to Elisha, visibly distressed, and told him what had happened. He said, "Alas, my lord! It was borrowed." His words carried the weight of regret and worry, as he knew he would have to bear the consequences of the accident. Elisha listened attentively, but without concern. He was not shaken by the young man's distress. Calmly, he asked, "Where did it fall?" The young man showed him the exact spot where the axe had sunk in the waters of the Jordan. Without hesitation, Elisha cut a piece of wood and threw it at the same spot where the axe had fallen. Something surprising happened. Immediately, the axe, which was supposed to sink due to the weight of the metal, began to float. The wood thrown by Elisha, touching the water, caused this miracle, and the axe rose to the surface of the water, visibly floating. The young prophet, eyes wide with amazement, saw the impossible happen before his eyes. Elisha calmly said to him, "Take him." The young man, now relieved and amazed, reached out and carefully took the axe back, grateful for divine intervention. This miracle, though simple in its manifestation, had great spiritual significance. For that young man, and for everyone who was present, it was a clear demonstration that God cares about even the small details of life. The lost axe, a simple borrowed object, became the setting for the manifestation of God's supernatural power, reminding everyone that nothing is too small for God's care. This recovery of the floating axe also symbolized God's ability to restore losses, no matter how insignificant they may seem. In God's great plan, even the moments of difficulty and small problems in life have their value, and He is willing to intervene to show His power and compassion. Thus, this young man not only recovered what he had lost, but also experienced, in a tangible way, the power of God through his prophet Elisha. He would never forget that moment when God made the impossible happen, proving that faith and obedience to Him can bring results beyond our comprehension. The revelation of the heavenly armies in Dothan. Elisha prays that God will open his servant's eyes, allowing him to see the multitude of angels who protect Israel from their enemies. the city of Dothan was surrounded. At dawn, Elisha's servant awoke and left, only to be confronted by a frightening sight. A vast crowd of Syrian soldiers, with horses and chariots, surrounded the entire city. In a panic, he ran back to Elisha, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "Oh, my lord! What shall we do?" he exclaimed, his voice trembling with despair. But Elisha, who was calm, replied in a surprising way, "Do not be afraid. Those who are with us are more numerous than those who are with them." The servant looked around, confused. He saw only the enemy army, and at his side only Elisha. The statement seemed impossible. How could they, 2 men alone, have the upper hand? Elisha noticed the servant's uneasiness, and with compassion and unwavering faith prayed to the Lord, "O Lord, open his eyes that he may see." And God answered. In an instant, the servant's eyes were opened to a new reality, a dimension he could not see before. What he saw left him speechless. Around Elisha and the whole city of Dothan, an invisible and supernatural army was now visible. Horses and chariots of fire, the heavenly armies of God, covered the surrounding hills and fields, far more numerous and powerful than the Syrian soldiers. They were heavenly warriors, resplendent, in shining armor and surrounded by a divine glory. These angels were there, ready to defend Elisha and the people of Israel. This vision not only brought comfort and hope to the servant, but also confirmed that God never abandons those who trust in him. At that moment, the servant understood that no matter how numerous or threatening the enemy is, God's power is infinitely greater. Elisha then prayed once more, this time asking the Lord to blind the Syrian army. And so it happened. The soldiers, now without sight, did not know where they were or what to do. Elisha confidently and fearlessly went to the commander of the army and surprisingly said to them, "This is not the way, nor is this the city. Follow me, and I will bring you to the man you are looking for." So the Syrians, blind and bewildered, followed Elisha to Samaria, the capital of Israel. When they arrived in Samaria, Elisha prayed again that the eyes of the Syrians would be opened. When they regained their sight, they realized that they were inside the walled city of Samaria, surrounded by the Israelite army. The king of Israel asked Elisha if he should attack them, but the prophet, in his wisdom and kindness, replied, "Do not kill them. Serve them food and drink, and let them return to their master." The king then prepared a great feast for the Syrian soldiers, and then sent them back home. Impressed by God's mercy and greatness, they never returned to attack Israel. The revelation of the heavenly hosts and the goodness of Elisha left a lasting mark on history. This experience served as a powerful reminder that God is always present, protecting his children with a strength that goes beyond our vision and comprehension. The temporary blindness of Syrians. Elisha intercedes for the Syrian army to be temporarily blinded and then leads them into the heart of Samaria. On a certain day, as the Syrian army advanced towards Elisha with the intention of capturing him, the prophet showed no fear. He knew that God was on his side and that nothing would happen without divine permission. This army came with a powerful force, determined to eliminate any resistance and to finish off the prophet of Israel. Elisha, serene in the midst of this threat, only watched the approach of the enemies. With an unshakable trust in God, Elisha raised his voice in prayer and asked for something surprising, "Lord, smite this people with blindness." God heard Elisha's prayer, and at the same moment a supernatural blindness came over every Syrian soldier. They were completely disoriented, not understanding where they were or who was around them. The soldiers began to stumble and bump into each other, confused and directionless, as they desperately tried to see something in the darkness that suddenly enveloped them. Elisha, seeing the situation, approached the commander of the Syrian army and, calmly and confidently, said, "You have come to the wrong place. I will lead you to the man you are looking for." In their blindness and bewilderment, the Syrian commander and his soldiers did not recognize Elisha and, trusting his voice, allowed themselves to be guided. Then, Elisha led the Syrian army directly to the heart of the city of Samaria, the capital of Israel. The journey was long, but Elisha guided every step of that blind army, and the soldiers followed him without question. Little did they know that they were being taken into enemy territory, where they would be surrounded by the Israeli army. When they finally reached the center of the city, Elisha prayed again, "Lord, open the eyes of these men that they may see." And so, once again, God granted Elisha's request. Suddenly, the soldiers' sight was restored, and they realized that they were no longer surrounding the prophet in Dothan, but rather surrounded by the walls and the Israelite army in Samaria. Imagine the terror stamped on the faces of those soldiers when they realized that they were totally vulnerable. They had been driven without resistance into the heart of enemy territory and were now without any defense. The king of Israel, seeing the Syrian army in his hands, asked Elisha with great enthusiasm, "Shall I kill you, my father? Should I kill them?" But Elisha, showing God's wisdom and mercy, replied in a surprising way, "Do not kill them. You would not kill those you captured with sword and bow. Instead, give them food and drink and let them return to their master." So the king of Israel prepared a great feast for the Syrian army, offering them food and drink. After being well fed, the Syrian soldiers were released to return to their own people. With this, a profound lesson was taught. Those soldiers returned home, knowing that they had been spared by the enemy whom they intended to capture, and they never returned to make war against Israel. This episode showed the power of God working through Elisha, but it also demonstrated godly compassion and wisdom. By sparing the lives of the soldiers, Elisha planted a seed of peace and respect, reminding everyone that even in times of war and conflict, mercy can prevail. The siege of Samaria and the prophecy of abundance. Elisha announces that the famine caused by the Syrian siege will soon end, and miraculously, food is plentiful after the enemies flee. Samaria was in despair. The city, surrounded by the powerful Syrian army, was facing a terrible famine. The Syrians, with their troops, had blocked all entrances, preventing food and supplies from reaching the people. The hunger was so intense that it reached the point where people paid small fortunes for a handful of food, and the situation grew bleaker by the day. It was against this backdrop that Elisha, God's prophet, stood up with a message that seemed impossible. He addressed the people and the king of Israel and proclaimed, "Tomorrow at this time there will be so much food that the price of a pound of flour will be almost nothing, and so will barley." The crowd, hungry and hopeless, was in shock. How could there be such abundance in just one day? The looks were doubtful, but Elisha remained firm in his message, knowing that this promise came from God himself. There was, however, an official close to the king who doubted and mocked the prophet. He said, "Even if the Lord were to open the floodgates of heaven, could that happen?" Elisha replied firmly, "You will see with your own eyes, but you will not eat of this food." While the city was plunged into unbelief, outside the walls, God was already at work. That same night, he caused a terrifying sound, like the noise of a huge army marching in. Syrian soldiers heard the sound of horses and chariots, as if a large military force was approaching to attack them. Convinced that the king of Israel had hired armies from other nations to fight them, the Syrians panicked. Desperate, they abandoned their camps, fleeing for their lives and leaving behind everything they had brought: tents, clothes, weapons, and, above all, food. That morning, four lepers, who were living outside the city due to their illness, decided to take a risk and went to the Syrian camp, hoping perhaps to get some food or even be killed, since they had nothing left to lose. When they got there, they were amazed by what they saw. The camp was empty. The Syrians had fled, but they had left behind an abundance of provisions. The lepers ate and drank their fill, and then filled sacks with silver, gold, and clothing. Then, in a moment of awareness, the lepers said to each other, "We are not doing good. This is a day of good news, and we are silent. Let's go back and tell the king's palace." They rushed back to the city and shared the news with the gatekeepers, who immediately informed the king. Still cautious, the king sent men to confirm that the Syrians had indeed fled. And indeed, they found the path strewn with abandoned belongings and provisions. Upon receiving this confirmation, the people of Samaria left en masse for the Syrian camp. As Elisha had foretold, there was an abundance of food, and the price of food fell dramatically. But in the midst of this celebration, a sad irony occurred. That officer who had mocked Elisha's prophecy was put to guard the gate of the city, and in the rush he was run over by the people and died, Just as Elisha had said, he saw the abundance, but could not taste it. In this way, God has shown that he is able to provide in the midst of any crisis and that his word is always fulfilled. The city of Samaria, which had experienced a terrible famine, now enjoyed a plentiful supply, and the people learned an important lesson about faith and God's faithfulness in keeping his promises, no matter how impossible they may seem. The meeting with King Hazael of Damascus. Elisha reveals the future of King Ben-Hadad and prophesies that Hazael will become king of Syria and cause suffering to Israel. Elisha's fame as a prophet of God had already spread to several nations, and even King Ben-Hadad of Syria, Israel's enemy, knew the power of his words. Once, King Ben-Hadad was seriously ill and heard that Elisha had arrived in Damascus. In the midst of suffering and the fear of death, the king decided to send Hazael, his trusted official, to consult Elisha and find out if he would recover from this illness. Loaded with gifts, Hazael set out for Elisha. Upon arriving, he said to the prophet, "Ben-Hadad king of Syria has sent me to ask if he will be healed of his sickness." Elisha looked at Hazael and gave a cryptic answer, saying, "Tell the king that he will recover, but the Lord has revealed to me that he will surely die." Elisha's face closed in sadness, and he stared at Hazael. That silence, full of heaviness and tension, made Hazael uncomfortable. Then, as if a terrible vision unfolded before his eyes, Elisha began to weep. Surprised, Hazael asked, "Why is my lord weeping?" Elisha, with a heavy heart, replied, "For I know the evil you will bring upon Israel. You will burn the fortresses, kill young warriors, crush children, and open the wombs of pregnant women." That hit Hazael like a blow. He was indignant and protested, "But what is your servant? A simple dog. How could I do such a thing?" But Elisha did not change his expression and replied with prophetic frankness, "The Lord has shown me that you will be the king of Syria." This encounter with Elisha awakened something deep in Hazael. He returned to the palace and, the next day, fulfilling the prophecy, smothered King Ben-Hadad with a wet cloth, taking the throne and becoming the new king of Syria. In time, all of Elisha's words were fulfilled. As Elisha had prophesied, Hazael became a merciless figure, bringing great suffering upon Israel and showing that God's words, no matter how harsh they may seem, are always fulfilled. This encounter with King Hazael is one of the dark moments in Elisha's life, where he realizes that even the power and vision God gives him cannot prevent the choices others will make. Elisha knew that God's will was above human understanding and that divine justice does not fail, even when the paths seem difficult and suffering inevitable. The death and last miracle of Elisha. After his death, God's power still operates in Elisha. A dead man is resurrected by touching his bones. Elisha's life was marked by countless miracles and signs of God's power, but even after his death, the Lord continued to show his power through his faithful prophet. Elisha served God until the end of his life, and when his time finally came, he left this world quietly, but left a legacy of faith and obedience. Time passed and Elisha was buried, his body resting in a simple grave, while Israel continued to face difficult times. Invasions by Moabite groups threatened the people, bringing fear and destruction. In the midst of this chaos, a group of men went out to bury a friend who had passed away. Carrying the body, they went to a place where they could properly bury it. As they walked, they suddenly saw a group of Moabites approaching in the distance. In a panic, the friends of the deceased did not have time to make a proper grave. When they saw the pit where Elisha had been buried, they quickly decided to throw their friend's body there, hoping to escape the impending danger. But what happened next was an astonishment to everyone. As soon as the dead man's body touched Elisha's bones, something miraculous happened. The man, who had been laid in the lifeless pit, came to life. He stood up and stood breathing, and alive in front of his unbelieving friends. Men looked at each other, amazed and frightened, knowing that the power of God was still at work through Elisha, even after his death. This last miracle not only impacted those present that day, but also spread the certainty of God's power and faithfulness to every corner of Israel. The story of Elisha was once again remembered and celebrated among the people. Even in his last miracle, Elisha testified of God's power, showing that the divine presence transcends even death. Thus, Elisha, the faithful prophet, continued to be a testimony of God's greatness and mercy, for even when his voice was silent, the Lord's power echoed through his life and his death. An extraordinary story, one that reminds us that those who serve God have an eternal impact, whose seeds of faith blossom forever in the hearts of God's people. These topics cover everything from Elisha's call to his last prophetic and miraculous acts, encapsulating his life and the profound role he played as Israel's prophet. These events are full of meaning and miracles, conveying the message of faith and the power of God working through Elisha. Conclusion. And there you have it, the incredible story of Elisha, a man of God whose life was marked by so many miracles, that even after his death, the power of God still worked through him. Elisha showed that the Lord is always taking care of his people, even in the most difficult moments, even when everything seems impossible. Now, as you think about all that you have seen, be aware, because the story of Elisha reminds us that God is by our side, even when we do not see. He transforms what seems lost into hope, what seems dead into life, and uses what we have in our hands to work miracles that only He can do. So, whenever life gives you bitter moments, remember that God still has the power to make the waters sweet. He still cares, guides, and protects us, just as He did for Elisha and the people of Israel.